Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, we've been talking a little bit about Sajid Javid, changes in the Home Office. He's now the new Home Secretary, appointed yesterday following the resignation of Amber Rudd. And as we said, there's been some speculation that he'll use his new post to change the government's immigration policy. Let's have a listen to him speaking yesterday.
We're going to have a strategy in place that does actually something the previous Home Secretary set out last week when she made a statement to Parliament as well, about making sure that we have an immigration policy that is fair, it treats people with respect and with decency, and that will be one of my most urgent tasks, to make sure that we look carefully at the policy and make sure that it achieves just that, fairness.
The new Home Secretary Sajid Javid. So some commentators today are suggesting this is a chance for the government to change direction on immigration. But if that does happen, would ministers have the support of the public? Ben Page from Ipsos Mori has the answers, I hope. Ben, welcome back to the Daily Politics. Has the public mood changed on immigration?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that it is absolutely the case that most people want to see it reduced. But the proportion of people who say they want to see it reduced a lot is falling. Spontaneous concern about it has fallen from 56% in 2015 down to only about 20% now. And the proportion of people who say that immigrants make a positive impact on this country has been rising, and it's now at 44%, up from 30% just 2 or 3 years ago. So the atmosphere is shifting, but people will still want to see immigration reduced.
Right, so you still say that sort of core principle of trying to bring down the overall numbers is still a concern. Where do you think it ranks? Because there have been points over the last 5 or 10 years when arguably immigration has been pretty well at the top.
Absolutely, and it was the top issue in Britain as recently as 2015. But since then, it's been falling quite sharply, and it's now about the 5th or 6th issue when people, Brexit has shot right up the charts in terms of people's anxieties. And so I think some of the decline is because people believe that immigration has fallen a bit since Brexit, and also perhaps that we're going to have a bit more control. We're still very divided as a country about it, with Remain voters very different from Leave voters in terms of their attitudes to it. Conservative voters much more excited about it than Labour voters. But nevertheless, there is some movement, and I think there's probably a little bit more flexibility for the government. Right.
I mean, have you done any work or much work behind the reasons for these shifts that you've talked about, the fall to 5th or 6th place in terms of political agenda?
I mean, it is in part the fact that Brexit and indeed the NHS have risen up the agenda since then and have swamped things. And when people are asked what are the top issues, it falls down. But I think it is also the sense that because we are leaving the European Union, there will be a new settlement and we will have got a bit more control. And for those people who are particularly concerned, that is part of it. So there is some of that. And I think also the other thing to bear in mind is that Britain is always changing. Britain is becoming more liberal, with a small l, on all sorts of issues. We just did a poll that showed that most of us would be completely unconcerned if Prince Harry married a man rather than a woman on May the 19th. So Britain is changing, and it's becoming more liberal on attitudes like race, on sexuality, etc. So that is going on, as well as shifting on the very specific issue of immigration.
When you mentioned the numbers at the very beginning, that people do want to see the numbers come down. What about targets? I mean, do people still favour having targets, the net migration target that's never been reached, the removals targets? I mean, that's quite specific, I accept. Yeah. But do people want those sorts of numbers?
They do want targets, but ironically, at the same time, they also believe that it's very unlikely that any government of any complexion, even if UKIP were in power, which is never going to happen, would actually ever be able to meet them. So you've got this sort of recognition that it's difficult, but also wanting something to be done.
Right, Ben Page, thank you very much. Well, we're joined now in the studio to discuss this by the leader of UKIP, Gerard Batten. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. Well, you've heard Ben Page saying it's fallen quite sharply, actually, down the agenda to 5th or 6th place. Spontaneous concern about immigration has fallen, and the country, changing all the time, is becoming more liberal on lots of issues. So it's lost for you, isn't it?
I think that what he was saying is that actually other things have replaced people's concerns with the more immediate, like Brexit, like the NHS, so it's just moved down the chart. And so I still think it's a big issue with people because we know that immigration isn't controlled. Basically, the idea that we have an immigration policy is ludicrous. We have an open door policy. We have at least, according to the ONS figures, 600,000 illegal migrants. Is probably more like 1 million. It could be anything. Nobody really knows anyway.
Right. Well, if nobody knows, you can't really be that specific about the figures. But how does it impact UKIP? I mean, do you accept that for UKIP, immigration was very much a central plank?
I think it still is. It still is for most people. It still is for us. It's one of our core policies that we should control it. And of course, you can't control it if you're in the European Union. And if we had this an customs arrangement with the EU, we still wouldn't be able to control it because we can't control who comes in and doesn't come into the country under EU rules. Right.
So why is no one really voting for UKIP? Your vote collapsed in the general election. Of the 126 councillors elected last time when these council elections were fought, you've now got half that number, less than half, 60. So, I mean, no one's listening to what you're saying.
I think there's two reasons for that, if I can answer your question. Number one is I think an awful lot of people thought that UKIP's job was done after the referendum. And secondly, we spent the last 2 years shooting ourselves in the foot. So I can understand why people may have thought that, you know, that it wasn't as an attractive option as it was. And my job is to try and make it an attractive option again.
Right. I mean, it's true, isn't it, that many people still feel that immigration is an important policy that the government needs to grapple with. And to some extent, UKIP put it right on the agenda and they feel the job's done.
Well, I don't know if the job's done. I mean, what we've seen with Windrush is that something has definitely gone wrong, so the job is definitely not done. We need to now come back. I think it's really positive that people are now starting to make the positive case for immigration. One of the issues that affects Oxfordshire, for example, is we can't get the scientists we need to staff the labs in Oxfordshire because of current immigration policy. The idea that we've got an open-door immigration policy is not correct. In fact, I think most people out there are very reasonable. If someone is an illegal migrant, no one is saying that we should just have a completely open-door policy, even the Liberal Democrats, who are very positive about immigration. But what we are saying is that if we've got a skills shortage, we should be making it easy for people to come. And more than that, I think what Windrush is showing us is we've got a real problem with the 3 million EU citizens who are here contributing. You know, they've got families here. 3 million people are going to have to go through what the Windrush generation had to go through. Do we really have faith that the Home Office knows what it's doing?
Right. Why do you say they will have to go through what the Windrush generation are going through? That's not the same, is it, as illegal immigration?
Well, actually, it's harder. No, not at all. No, and neither is the Windrush generation.
Right.
They were here legally and they were promised that they could stay. That's exactly the same as the 3 million.
Right. What do you say to that? I mean, can you understand the concerns of EU citizens who are living here, the rights that they will have afterwards, after, if you take the government's line on it, a mistake, a massive mistake over people who did have a right to be here, the Windrush generation?
What we've always said is that there can be a deal between the EU citizens living here. They can stay, they can have the rights they've got. All we need to do is to know who they are. And the same would apply to our citizens in the EU. And that number was vastly overestimated, by the way. I was putting out a figure of about 1.2, 1.3 million during the referendum campaign. I've seen figures recently which suggest there's only about 800,000 UK citizens on the continent. So they're going to get a much better deal than we are because there's far more of them.
Right. How bad is it going to be for you in Thursday's local elections?
Well, I inherited nothing when I took over on the 17th of February. There was no election campaign, nothing had been planned. It was a complete disaster. So the mere fact that there are 554 candidates means there's 554 more than there would have been if I hadn't taken over and the party hadn't backed me.
Right.
The way I'm going to judge success, if I may say, is yes, we want to retain seats that we're fighting, we want to win some more, but it's about, for me, the percentage of the vote. Are we going back up? In the 41 local council elections prior to April, we got 7% of the vote as an average. So if I get between 5 and 7% of the vote where we stand in this election, I will take that as a positive.
And if you don't, do you think it's over for UKIP?
No, I don't, because I think that there is a long-term fight here. Even if we do have this mythical deal and get out of the EU, we're not really going to be leaving. There are going to be lots of constraints, and there's going to be a fight going on beyond that to actually get our real sovereignty and independence back. Right.
You say you've been left with nothing in terms of organisation for these local elections, but you yourself aren't even prepared to stay on as leader. It's hardly a vote of confidence because it seems to be an admission that UKIP is in decline permanently.
That's not fair representation, Joe. What I said, I was asked to step up as the interim leader. I had no personal leadership ambitions. I was quite happy to serve under a competent leader. Unfortunately, we didn't have one in Henry Bolton. I offered to serve as the interim leader for 3 months in order to get the thing back on track. People were saying that's not long enough. will you stand as the leader? I said, I don't want to do 4 years, I'll do a year, so that we get the party back on track, and at the end of that we have another election campaign. At the end of that year, if I'm really enjoying it and it's going well, I might decide to stand. But I'm not doing this for my personal aggrandisement. I'm doing it because I want UKIP to survive, because I believe in what we represent.
Well, on the issue of UKIP's survival, former party leader Nigel Farage warned that UKIP will be finished if it goes down the road of becoming an anti-Islam party. Is he right? I'm
not an anti... I know what you're trying to say here, but I'm not an anti-Islam. I draw attention to the problems that the Islamic ideology brings to our country, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I'd be surprised if Nigel didn't agree with that.
Right, but you have made some comments recently, as you seem to know. I mean, you said the reason that there is this degree of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, in my view, in your view, is because it very much depends on Muslim voters in inner cities, and the Muslim religion is inherently anti-Semitic, and therefore they are pandering to a certain section of Londoners. Do you stand by that?
I didn't say of Londoners, I said of the electorate in urban areas.
Well, do you stand by that?
Absolutely. And in fact, after
Well, if that's not anti-Islam, I don't know what is.
Anti-Islamic ideology. I have nothing against individuals. I take people as I find them, but the ideology of Islam is inherently anti-Semitic.
What do you say?
That is complete rubbish.
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm the first MP of Palestinian descent. I've lived in Jordan, we've lived in Egypt. I know, I'm Christian myself, but I know plenty of people who are, I'm bowled over by what you've just said.
Well,
that is absolutely not true.
Maybe you should read the Quran and the Hadith educate yourself.
I actually have. Have you?
Yes.
I'd be surprised if there are many Muslim people out there who agree with what you're saying. I actually think it's a peaceful religion. What you may be talking about are extremists within a certain ideology, and there are extremists in all ideologies,
they are literalists,
including your own.
They're not extremists, they are literalists who take it literally. A lot of Muslims don't, thank goodness, but a lot of people do take it literally.
So you accept it's an extremist faction that isn't representative of the whole of Islam?
I accept that it's a literist interpretation of certain teachings.
But you have talked about Muslim voters in general in inner cities and the Muslim religion as a whole, that it's inherently anti-Semitic. Where did you find that in the Quran?
Well, in the Hadith, if you want me to quote it to you, take it from the Prophet himself. He says, Judgment Day will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews. And the Jews will hide behind the rocks and the trees, and the rocks and the trees will cry out, O Muslim, O faithful servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. I don't know how anti-Semitic you need to get.
Unbelievable. Look, there are also passages in the Bible that are equally ridiculous. I mean, it's a allegory. The vast majority of Christians would not agree with half the passages in the Bible.
There's nothing in the Gospels of equivalence. There's nothing in the Gospels which Christians live by, which is of any way equivalent
that Christians live by, and I would argue that the vast majority of people who live by modern Islam don't live by those kind of passages.
Well, that's a relief, thank you.
Do you think this will win you votes in inner cities?
It's not about winning votes, it's about saying what I believe is true. And if I'm asked the question, I try to give an honest and truthful answer. And after I made those comments on the Peston programme, I looked at the comments that came in, and they were overwhelmingly supportive of what I said.
Right, from who?
Well, on Twitter, on people who rang the office, on emails.
Right. I mean,
I had very few negative feedback.
The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, says, I am appalled at the ignorance that Gerard Batten appears to have shown when speaking about the faith that I and hundreds of thousands of British Muslims practice. As a minority, I know what it's like to be different. Sajid Karim, Conservative MEP, the vast majority of Britons find your views on Muslims repugnant and reminiscent of another era where a whole religious community was stigmatised and targeted in this very same way. Do you have any regret about what you said? I mean, these are, high-profile...
If anybody doesn't know the truth of this, go and buy yourself a copy of the Quran and the Hadith and read it. Don't take my word for it. Read it yourself. Research a bit.
Gerard Batten, thank you for coming in. A little later...
This country needs to be tough on people who shouldn't be here. And outside of the bubble which Rachel clearly inhabits, that is what people think. They think that if you're not meant to be here, you should clear off. It should be tough on illegal immigration. That's what most people outside of the bubble that a lot of journalists and MPs live in is the truth of it. I mean, essentially, the Windrush scandal, it was a scandal, was an appalling administrative error with people who should be and every right to be here. But we mustn't equate that to illegal immigration. That's a different thing. People like Rachel Rachel and Labour Party are trying to make sure they're all the same thing. It's all based in a big immigration mess. It is a mess, but it's you can see how it was basically an administrative error which committed by Home Office, which has now been cleared up, thank goodness. And Amber Rudd went because she misled MPs inadvertently about targets. So all these things are different things. They're all being turned into one thing by people like Rachel.
But Rachel, do you think that charge is fair that you are living in a bit of a bubble? You know, we go out and about as journalists, talk to lots of people around the country, and immigration does come up as an issue, illegal or illegal, it has to be said. It is an issue for a lot of people. I know you think that it's not something that causes issues here in the UK, but a lot of people believe it does.
I think the problem that we have has been in play for decades now, and it is the story of immigration that we have told in Britain, which is there are very real economic hardships in this country. Most of us are struggling. The economic system has been programmed, in fact, to make sure that very few do very well and the rest of us do struggle. We have stagnating wages, we have falling productivity. Only Greece is doing worse than us when it comes to Europe. So, of course, there are problems. And the dialogue for decades, perpetrated by politicians and by the media, has been that all these woes, all these economic problems, all the strain on our public services, all the job insecurity that we feel, which is real, all of that is to do with immigration, and it is a false narrative. It is demonizing and scapegoating a group of people who have nothing to do with our economic ailments. In fact, the very fact that we have people wanting to come to this country is a sign of an economic boom. The problem is that our economy is massively unequal. It is a divided country, and most people are not seeing the benefits of the economy. That has nothing to do with immigration, but that is the myth that has been perpetrated for decades. And I think if the Windrush scandal has taught us anything, it has taught us that that narrative has to end.
Well, let's put this point to Christopher. I mean, do you believe that you are peddling this narrative?
I'm peddling no narratives. We're reporting in the Telegraph what people think. The concern, of course, has always been that uncontrolled immigration...
But what people think, Christopher, sorry, you know, these words are important, isn't it? You're reporting what people think, but are you reporting on the reality?
It is reality, because there's no question that uncontrolled immigration, as we have seen as being members of the European Union, particularly from the A8, the accession 8 countries since around 2003, has overwhelmed public services in parts of the country. I think there was definitely a failure of response by political leaders to deal with that. More hospitals, schools, all those kind of public services need to avoid people feeling overwhelmed by more people arriving. And if you believe in the immigration narrative of the Vote Leave campaign, it was about getting back control. This country is not anti-immigration, as Rachel was trying to say. It wants control. It wants to feel as though that we can control our own environment, where we live, access to services. We welcomed all sorts of people. For goodness sake, Sajid Javid is now in the cabinet. That is a testament to this country's acceptance of immigration.
Rachel, you know, the point that you were living in a bubble earlier, I mean, there are 5.5 million people who were not born in the UK living in this country now. A lot of people out there will say that these things like pressure on public services is caused by that, because that's what they see when they go to the doctor's surgery. They see a lot of different coloured faces that they used to see in that waiting room.
Unfortunately for Chris, there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that any of those things that he's saying is true. Study after study, report after report. Let's give one example. The LSE report has shown that there is no evidence that migrants put pressure on public services such as schools and hospitals. If anything, they are propping up those systems at the moment. The reason that those systems, that there is pressure on public services, is economic. It is driven by our economic policy. It is driven by austerity, unnecessary ideological cuts that have ravaged our public services and torn apart our communities. And actually, I don't think the public is hostile to immigration. I think actually what Diane Abbott said about it is quite likely that people are draconian in theory, but actually very humane in practice. And there are reports, again, report after report, that people do want immigration when you break it down sector by sector. When you say to people, do you want migrants to come here and work in the NHS or construction or retail or agriculture, the answer is always a resounding yes. So there is a disconnect there. And I think that disconnect is in part down to this narrative, this relentless narrative that the media and politicians have been demonizing migrants for a very, very long time, making them the source of our economic woe, when that is quite simply not the case, and it has to stop.
Well, Christopher, that same report from the LSE, it pointed out the reasons why there are, more people in waiting room, largely due to an ageing population and a rising birth rate. Why is it, do you think, that immigration is seen as the cause of a lot of woes when, as Shabby says, we've just look what's happened with people applying for nursing jobs. Numbers coming from the EU have plummeted dramatically, and it's going to cause an issue for the NHS.
I think, I mean, Shabby's right in the sense that immigration has been a catch-all, being blamed by lots of people for lots of things. I think what's interesting is that there is movement on this. Look at Boris Johnson last week saying that there should be an amnesty for anyone here who shouldn't be here. And that's quite interesting coming from Boris Johnson as a Foreign Secretary and possibly a future leader of the party. I think that after Britain leaves the European Union, when there was a feeling of degree of control at the border, I think you might find more of those ideas coming forward. I think that immigration will stop being the stick to beat everything with. But I think there has been a concern. I mean, I haven't read the LSE report you're describing there, but there has been a concern about immigration and its effect on public services.
OK, Christopher Hope from the Daily Telegraph, Rachel Shabby, journalist and author, thank you both very much. We will be discussing immigration a lot more, I sense.
So the new Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, says he's rejecting the hostile environment policy on immigration, but that isn't much comfort to those who are already caught up in its net. Last week, the Home Office said children of the Windrush generation would be eligible for free citizenship. But today, they appear less certain what that means. We've been following the case of one 64-year-old grandmother who came here from Jamaica from her 9-month detention in Yarlswood to her reunion with her family after her release. And she's still being told she cannot stay. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, has this exclusive report.
Sunday night, and inside a UK immigration detention centre, an elderly woman faces deportation any day now to Jamaica, a place she hasn't seen in almost 20 years, where she knows nobody.
Of course I'm scared. I have nowhere to live. I have nothing to go back to Jamaica with.
She is the daughter of the Windrush generation, caught now in a legal limbo. She says all her family is in the UK and she'll never see them again.
The only time I can see them is they come and visit you. I'm so scared when they come and gone. I used to live a happy life with them.
Then, without warning, a complete change in her story the very next day.
Have you got a coat?
No, I've
Do you want me to carry something?
Yes.
Yvonne Smith, 64 years old and a grandmother.
So how long were you in there for?
Just a couple of 4 months, 9 months.
9 months?
9 months.
Freed from Yarlswood Detention Centre yesterday after 9 months in captivity.
They treat you like you're criminals. They search you, going through the door, coming out, they search you.
No warning, no explanation. She says she was just suddenly told, you're released.
I jumped for joy.
So no forced deportation. Instead, we gave her a lift home to Birmingham, where for 20 years she's cared for her father. But on arrival, we suddenly learned from the Home Office that Yvonne has been released, but pending deportation still.
During the car journey from Yarlswood to here in Birmingham, Yvonne was adamant she was given no reason at all as to why she was suddenly being released. And yet during that journey, the Home Office told us by email that she's being released pending deportation. It seems odd. If they could tell Channel 4 News that, why couldn't they tell Yvonne that?
But more of that looming deportation in a moment. First, Yvonne wants to see the home she last visited 9 months ago.
Pleased to meet you. Later. Okay, then. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
But no time to stay in the flat. Just a few minutes there to drop off the baggage. The urgent business lies a couple of streets away, and she's desperate to get there fast. She thought she would never see her 92-year-old father Joseph ever again. far too ill to visit her these past 9 months. He has no idea she's been released.
Oh dear, we know that, Dad. I'm here. But I get a surprise. Lord God. Yes, so you can. Oh my God, you let me there. Oh, you too bad. Oh, you boy, fire like a way like now. No worry about it. Don't worry. I want my things. I do something. What then gone now?
Joseph, at 92, is disabled by a stroke and has relied on Yvonne as his principal carer. Beyond him, 4 brothers, 2 sisters, 2 children, 4 grandchildren, 16 nieces and nephews, and yet she's freed, says the Home Office, still pending deportation.
What they mean by that, I would like to know. So why you release me and telling me I've been pending for deportation? Why? So why release me? I think it's rubbish. They need to get a grip and give me some different reason.
Yesterday, the Home Office said she was here illegally and had overstayed in the UK by more than 10 years and should be deported, despite all her immediate family being in this country. But that deportation threat now appears at odds with the Home Office and government's position on the Windrush generation and their children. On Monday last week, the former Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, offered an unequivocal apology to the Windrush generation. Hours later, this announcement on the new rights that would be extended to them, posted by her, by the Home Office and by UK Visas and Immigration. It says Windrushers who arrived before 1973 will be eligible for free citizenship, and it also says
the offer, which will be available to people from all Commonwealth countries, not just Caribbean nationals, will extend to individuals who have no current documentation, those who already have leave to remain and want to advance their status, and children of the Windrush generation.
Now, since nobody is questioning the status of Joseph Smith, his daughter Yvonne appears to be a Windrush child, which leaves the Home Office apparently saying on the one hand she has the right to a British passport right now, and on the other she's here illegally and must be deported. For so many caught up in the wake of Windrush, hers appears to be another story of the tension between legality and morality and its unforeseen byproduct, cruelty.
Lord my God. I let you out? Yes.
So the rules which govern who is and who isn't entitled to enter the UK are pretty complex, depending which country you come from. There are different rights to work and stay. Let's start with the easy bit. Anyone from the European Economic Area or Switzerland has the right to live and work in Britain unrestricted. And until the UK leaves the EU, those rights will stay the same. But here's where it gets complicated, because for every single other country, there is a unique set of rules, and they keep changing. The countries whose nationals don't require visas for trips less than 6 months include the USA, Brazil and Israel, along with some Commonwealth countries, but not all. For example, anyone from Australia, New Zealand, Canada and most of the Caribbean don't need a visa. But visitors from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and most of the Commonwealth's African members, they do generally need a visa, even if they're only tourists. The only blanket rule for Commonwealth citizens applies to what's called right of abode, which in special, rare circumstances gives people the right to live and work in Britain unrestricted. Well, I'm joined now from the House of Commons by the Conservative MP Sir Roger Gale and Labour's Chuka Umunna. Sir Roger, as you just saw, we've told the story there of a 64-year-old child of a Windrush immigrant who has been locked up for 9 months by your government and is now released, being told she's to be deported. Why is the Home Office handling her case and so many others like it so incompetently?
Just to correct you, I heard part of the story, but I didn't see it at all. The fact of the matter is that the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and Amber Rudd have all made it absolutely plain that we want a system that is consistent and fair. The overwhelming majority of Windrush immigrants are already registered properly in the United Kingdom. Clearly something has gone wrong for a small number that aren't.
How do you know it's small?
And that has to be put right. Well, the numbers that are coming forward and the numbers that are registering the Home Office are relatively small compared with the number of people that came in. Now, one person suffering is one too many, so let's get that clear. but it is being put right. But that cannot be and must not be allowed to be, as we said in the chamber yesterday, an open door policy for anybody, including other genuinely illegal immigrants. And one of my close neighbours, a Windrush immigrant, said himself yesterday that while it's difficult to get the necessary papers, he himself recognises as a legal migrant that we have to control illegal immigration.
I'm not sure why you're talking about illegal immigration. I didn't ask you about it. Chuka Amuna, what do you make of the fact that this keeps coming back to illegal immigration when you ask people about Windrush victims?
Well, you ask a very good question. Why was Sir Roger immediately going to that issue? I think the problem here, Christian, that we've got is that we've had a toxic debate around the issue of immigration in this country for several years, and we need to reset it. We talk about immigrants to this country, I'm the son of one, as if they're the problem. We scapegoat them too often for so many of the ills of this country, when it's the politicians in this place over the decades who have meant that we've seen policies delivering, well, not delivering sufficiently for people in housing, around jobs, etc. Immigrants have always been a convenient dumping ground for blame when it comes to those issues. So let's reset the debate. Let's not treat immigrants as if they shouldn't be here in the first instance, as if they're guilty to proven innocent, and actually change the system. Because what happens with the debate and the system at the moment, which I'm sorry, Roger, is not fair and isn't consistent, is you end up with the absurdity where you have a Prime Minister, since she has been Prime Minister, refusing to temporarily lift the number of visas granted under Tier 2 of the immigration system to allow more doctors and clinicians to come to this country to staff the NHS, which has staff shortages. That's the absurdity of where you end up in.
Is now incompetent. I mean, we used to talk about it being fit for purpose.
Oh, undoubtedly
how
so,
would you
Christian.
describe it?
I think it is incompetent, and I think, I mean, I used to clerk my predecessors' surgeries when I wasn't an MP, and since I've been doing surgeries as an MP, and we've got a large immigrant population in Lambeth, I mean, it is incompetent, it is inefficient, it takes ages for a decision to be made. Often when you meet people and see what is written on paper, decisions come forward which don't seem to bear any relation to the reality of the circumstances of the situation. But when you have a kind of target-driven system with this ridiculous net migration target, which I think is wrong anyway, but the government's not going to be able to meet, so it further lowers trust in the system, you know, these are the types of things that you see happening. And again, another absurdity, you have students, we need students. Higher education is one of our biggest exports in this country. They fall within this ridiculous net migration target. So let's reset this debate. And perhaps, you know, Christian, maybe we should have a bit more of a conversation about how we better integrate immigrants when they come to our country, instead of this absolute obsession with numbers, which often are very arbitrary.
So, Roger Gale, would you like to have that conversation?
I have a significant number of legal migrants in my constituency. They work in the hospitals, they work in old people's homes, they work on the land, they make a significant contribution to the community. They are legal migrants.
But why do you see them as legal migrants?
You've had your say, let me have mine. I understand that you don't want to talk about illegal migrants. The fact of the matter is that the illegal migrants and those that traffic in them cause misery. They lead to, in some cases, modern slavery, and they damage the cause of legal migrants. And it's time that people like you understood that.
What do you mean by people like me?
I mean precisely what you said, because you told me you didn't want to talk about it.
Well, I'm not
Sorry,
sure.
I'm not sure what I mean by people like me, but
I mean people like you as a television reporter.
Right. Okay. But so it's not because I'm Asian, is it?
I couldn't care less what colour,
okay.
class,
I just wanted
or
to clarify that.
But the point is, why don't we have a more healthy debate about this, Roger? I don't think anybody is saying that if people are here unlawfully, they haven't complied with the rules, that we shouldn't take any action. But the problem is, hang on just a moment, the entire debate is, if you like, coloured by this sense that people wanting to come here want to break the rules, that they are here illegally, that they're guilty to proven innocent, and that's how you end up with these absurdities. I've had a constituent
you've said a great deal.
A constituent, he needed NHS treatment, he needed cancer treatment, and because of this hostile environment that has been created, he hasn't, until recently, and it was raised in the House of Commons, be able to get radiotherapy treatment. He's a son of a Windrush generation family.
You've said, why don't we talk about illegal immigrants? But Christian doesn't want to talk about illegal immigrants. There are a significant number of illegal immigrants in this country. They are trafficked. That traffic causes misery.
But no one's denying that.
The people themselves, well, you're in self-denial because you're trying to say the Windrush issue is the only issue.
No,
it is a very
when have I said during this interview that it's the only
Krishna has.
issue? No, Krishna hasn't said that.
It's a very important issue, but it's not the only issue.
But nobody's saying that. Krishna, neither me nor Krishna is saying it is the only issue. What we're saying is, let's have a more healthy debate about this. Let's not talk about all immigrants and put everybody into the same bracket. No one's saying don't talk about illegal immigration. No one's saying don't apply the rules. But actually, why don't we have a more healthy debate about this?
No, I think we should start by applying the rules. People are illegal immigrants because they are here illegally. We have to do something about that. I want the people who are in my constituency as legal migrants to be secure, to contribute, as indeed they do. There is a fundamental difference. And I'm sorry, Chuka, you and Christian don't seem to get it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sir Roger. Thank you very much indeed. Just for clarity, it's not about me getting it. I'm here to ask you questions. That's all I'm doing, but thank you very much indeed for joining.